The doctor handed me a note. "Don't go home, run!" That night I discovered what they were hiding. I remember the night as if it were yesterday, the stale scent of overcooked meat on the table, the heavy silence broken only by the clinking of forks against plates. Ricardo looked across at me, his eyes burning with something I had seen too many times before, hatred mixed with shame. "You think I should be grateful, don't you?" he spat. "The thing I hate most in this life is the poverty and shame you passed on to me. At school, at work, people laughed, called me every filthy name in the book. All of it was your fault. If you had not given birth to me like this, my life would never have been such a disgrace." I sat still, not because his words did not cut, but because they cut so deep I had learned not to bleed in front of him. Karen leaned back in her chair, her thin smile twisting into cruelty. "He's right," she sneered. "If it wasn't for you, Ricardo would not have had to grow up as a filthy charity case in this town. You are not just a burden, you are a stain, something shameful we have to carry around." My grandson, too young to fully know the poison of his words, but already repeating what he heard in this house, tossed his fork down and said casually, "If Grandma just died already, I could go to a private school. Who wants to be laughed at for having a beggar grandmother at home?" His words cut sharper than Ricardo's because they came from innocence twisted into cruelty. I thought back to the years when I sold our ancestral land, piece by piece, to pay Ricardo's college tuition, to help him when he was drowning in debt after his business fell apart. I remembered the nights I stayed awake sewing until my fingers bled, just to make sure he had enough to eat. Yet out there, in front of our neighbors and the church, Ricardo told a different story. "My mother never helped me, never lifted a finger. She is just a parasite who lives off me." And people believed him, because sometimes lies shouted loud enough can drown out the truth whispered in the dark. In his eyes, I was not his mother anymore. I was the reason he was mocked, the reason he could not erase his past, the reason he was not a man other men respected. And then there was Mark. I had taken Mark in when he was a boy without a family, a child who grew up under my roof, who called me Mama when he had no one else. Now he was a reserve officer, respected in town, polite, well-dressed, with a strong handshake that made people nod in approval. I never hid my pride in him, and maybe Ricardo heard it in my voice too often. Ricardo's jealousy festered like an old wound. He would not say Mark's name, but when the neighbors joked, "Mark treats Martha better than her own blood," I saw Ricardo's jaw tighten. Karen fanned the flames whenever she could. "Isn't it funny," she whispered one evening, while she poured herself another glass of wine, "that your mother's godson turned out better than her real son? Everyone calls her Mark's mother, not yours." Ricardo slammed his fist on the table so hard the glasses shook. "Always him," he shouted. "That boy, always lifted up by her as if he is worth something, and me, her flesh and blood, treated like garbage." His rage filled the room like smoke choking the air, and I could not breathe. I had learned long ago not to defend myself. Nothing I could say would ease the hatred in his heart. I only looked at him and thought how strange life was, that a man could despise his own history so much he would rather destroy the woman who gave him life. He saw Mark as proof of everything he was not, and he hated me for bringing Mark close. The silence after his outburst was thick, suffocating. I could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall, each second a reminder of how long I had endured this contempt. Karen leaned across the table, her eyes glittering like broken glass. "Face it, Martha," she hissed. "Nobody wants you. You are a relic, a reminder of everything Ricardo wants to forget. If you disappeared, the whole house would be cleaner, freer. You should be grateful he has not thrown you out yet." My grandson giggled, not understanding the depth of the poison in those words. "Maybe we should put a tombstone in the backyard for Grandma," he said, "so she can sleep forever and we can finally be free." The table erupted in cruel laughter, but I only bowed my head. Inside me, a storm raged, not of anger but of grief. I tell you this so you can understand the weight of injustice and why I still keep speaking. Stories like mine carry the voices of mothers who endured the unendurable. If you feel justice deserves celebration, smash that hype button. Let us keep stories like this alive, echoing far, far away. Your support helps us bring understanding and love to those who deserve it. Thank you so much. Keep listening. Even as Ricardo's voice filled the house with venom, I clutched at the last fragments of memory when he was a boy with kind eyes, when he used to cling to me in thunderstorms, whispering, "Mama, do not let go." But those days were gone. The boy I once knew had buried himself under bitterness, under shame, under a hatred so strong he could no longer see me as his mother. All that remained in him was a man convinced that the only way to silence his own shame was to silence me. I looked at his face across the table, lit by the weak yellow lamp, and I saw not just my son, but the weight of generations. I had carried him, nursed him, sacrificed everything for him, and yet here he was, spitting our shared past back into my face as if it were poison. My silence was not surrender, it was survival. Because deep inside, I knew the storm was only beginning, and I would need every ounce of strength left in me to face what was coming next. I began to notice the changes in small, unsettling ways. The taste of my food grew bitter, metallic, like something that did not belong. My medicine bottles smelled different when I opened them, the faint odor sharp enough to sting my nose. At first, I thought my senses were failing me with age, but the suspicion grew each time Ricardo handed me a glass of juice or Karen placed a bowl of soup before me, watching too closely, waiting for me to swallow. My body still breathed, but in my heart, I began to wonder if they were already preparing for my death. One morning, I went for my routine checkup at Dr. Henry Alvarez's clinic. He had known me for decades, since before Ricardo was born, since before I carried the burden of being a single mother in a town that never forgave either. "Doctor?" Henry leaned close as he checked my pulse, and without speaking, he slid a folded piece of paper into my palm. I waited until I was alone in the restroom before I opened it. The words were hurried, scrawled with urgency. "Do not go back home. They are poisoning your food. And there is something in the cellar you must know about." My hands shook, not from weakness, but from the chill that ran through me. The house I had built with sweat and sacrifice was no longer a refuge. It was a trap. I folded the note into my skirt pocket, and when the time came to leave, I leaned closer to him and whispered, "If I disappear, promise me you will call the police. And tell Mark Jensen, my godson. He will know what to do. He will not let me be forgotten." Dr. Henry nodded solemnly, his eyes heavy with knowledge and pity. I walked out of that clinic with my heart pounding, carrying the secret like a stone pressed against my chest. The weight of Ricardo's bitterness had always been heavy, but it was in those days that it grew darker, sharper, impossible to ignore. In town, I could not take a step without hearing whispers, sometimes said to my face, sometimes just loud enough for me to catch. "That boy Mark treats Martha like a real son. He is devoted and successful. More than her own blood." Their words carried admiration, but to Ricardo, they were insults carved into his pride. Every neighbor who praised Mark was, in Ricardo's mind, mocking him. One evening, over dinner, Ricardo's temper exploded. He slammed his fork down so hard the clatter made my grandson flinch. "You all talk about Mark like he is some kind of saint," Ricardo hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "But he is nothing. Nothing. He is not blood. He is not family. He is just a boy who came crawling here, and somehow he is lifted above me. Above me. Your own son." His words shook with the fury of a man who hated the reflection he saw in every mirror, hated the reminders of what he could never be. Karen, never missing an opportunity to twist the knife, leaned back in her chair and laughed softly, her voice like ice sliding over stone. "Isn't it funny," she said, "that your mother's godson turned out to be more successful than her real son? People out there call her Mark's mother. They do not even mention you, Ricardo. You're invisible." She smirked as she poured herself another glass of wine. "Maybe that is what you really hate, not Mark, but the fact that she has a son she can be proud of, and it is not you." The table went still as Ricardo's face twisted with rage. He slammed his hands against the wood so hard the dishes rattled, and he leaned across toward me, his spit flecking the table as he shouted, "Again with him. Always his face. Always him being praised, lifted, loved. He is not your blood, yet you cradle him like a treasure, while me, your own flesh, your own son, you treat like garbage. You look at me and see a curse, but you look at him and see hope. Is that not true, Mama?" The air burned with Ricardo's words. My grandson shrank back, but Karen only smirked, feeding the chaos. I sat still, hands folded, knowing silence was my only shield. His envy of Mark had grown into something monstrous. He could not forgive the town for respecting a man with no blood tie, only shared love. He saw betrayal where there was none, but the truth was he had betrayed himself, letting bitterness consume him. I watched him seethe, eyes darting for approval he would never earn, dignity he would never claim. In that moment, I knew envy was a poison more lethal than anything in my food. Ricardo was drowning in it, and he would not stop until he destroyed either Mark or me. I pressed my lips together, holding back words that could only fuel his rage. Instead, I prayed for strength, because I sensed what was coming. His hatred would not remain words much longer. Soon it would spill into action, and when that time came, I would need every ounce of will to endure. They set the glass down with a certainty that made my hands tremble. Karen pushed it toward me across the scarred oak table, as if the movement could sweep me out of their lives, and Ricardo's eyes never left mine. They were hard and small, with the smugness of a man who believes he is finally brave enough to be cruel. "Drink it," Karen said, smiling like a woman offering a guest a cup of tea. Her smile was a blade. "Drink up. Sleep well tonight. Tomorrow we will announce your funeral for this miserable woman." The words hung in the air, thick and ordinary as smoke, and my grandson laughed in a high, stupid little sound that made my skin crawl, because he had learned laughter here, at the table where love should have lived. Ricardo leaned forward, voice low and rough. "Mama, do it. Make it easy. Do not force me to dirty my hands. I have suffered enough with that name attached to me. Let me wash the shame away. Send yourself off to see your precious son up in heaven." He spat the name like it was a spell. "Give him a hug for me when you get there, Mama. Go on, tell that man he stole what should have been mine." I could feel the room tilt, the air clenched tight around my chest. It is strange how words can be a kind of poison. There was no bitter tang, no coppery bite like the medicines I suspected, but the venom in his sentences indeed found a way to lodge in my throat. I kept my face still. If I showed how his words bruised me, he would take that as victory. I had spent a lifetime learning how not to flinch, how to fold my hurt into small shreds and hide them in places no one cared to look. The glass was orange and cheery in the lamplight, juice sweating on the rim. Karen watched me with a patience that had nothing to do with mercy. The glass seemed to pulse, a small sun in their hands, and I thought, absurdly, of the first orange tree I planted in the yard when Ricardo was small, how he would press his face to the trunk and giggle when the leaves brushed his cheek, how quickly the fruit of that tree had turned to this. I picked the glass up as if it might be a bowl of comfort, brought it to my lips, and pretended the tremor in my hand came from weakness, from age. I felt their eyes measure my movement, weigh it like scales. I tilted the glass and let the liquid touch my tongue. Then when all of them leaned forward with expectation and hunger, I spilled the rest into the potted plant at my feet as casually as a woman tending her greenery. The soil drank it. The water sloshed dark against the terracotta. None of them noticed the change in the color of the dirt because they were watching the face they wanted to watch, the face of an old woman who would finally be obedient. It was not a grand trick. It was small and desperate. I watched Ricardo's chest swell with triumph, his shoulders relax as if he had removed a weight that had been strapped to him for years. He believed the job was done, the last tie cut, but the silence that came after their satisfaction was louder than the words. "Do you hate yourself so much, Ricardo?" I asked softly when their amusement had dimmed and the house hummed with the same small noises I had heard since my husband died. "Do you hate who you are so much that you would rather bury me to make the world safer for you? Have I been so unforgivable that your answer is to kill me?" He looked at me then, with a face like a stone. The tenderness that had lived in him once, in the small boy who used to hide under my skirts during thunderstorms, had long since been consumed. "You gave me that curse," he said, each syllable a flint. You gave me this ugly life and shame. The only way anyone will respect me is if they forget you existed. If they do not see you, they will not see me as less. He did not see how his words chained him further. He only saw the way the town might straighten itself if he could cut away what he called his burden. I remember the exact way the light fell across his jaw that night, the way his mouth worked while he watched me, as if he expected me to beg. But I had learned the economy of silence. Begging would have dragged me farther into the soil he wished to bury me in. Silence kept my head above that surface a little longer. I had to buy time. I had to live long enough for the one person I trusted to arrive, for a plan that did not depend on the fragile mercy of a son-turned-enemy. They did not know what I had done earlier that week, the small and careful things I had managed between appointments and the slow, steady work of my days. I had not been idle. I had watched and recorded, kept the little suspicions locked away so that when Dr. Henry passed me that note in his office, I could hold it like a promise against my skin. I had tucked other things away too, a memory, a photograph, a scrap of evidence to remind me that I had not been foolish. Ricardo's eyes floated to the empty chair by the window, where photographs of Mark leaned against a plant pot, the frame simple, Mark smiling in a uniform that looked like armor. He always softened when he believed people saw him as someone's son, as someone worthy. I knew Ricardo called it betrayal. He thought my kindness to Mark was a slight. He did not understand that love is not a fixed portion to be divided. My love had room enough that giving to one did not mean taking from another. He could not forgive this truth. Karen clapped softly at his outburst, as if encouraging the performance, her eyes bright with the cruel delight of someone who enjoys the spectacle of humiliation. "Tell us," she cooed. "Tell us why she loves that boy more than she loves her own flesh. Tell us how she can sleep at night." I could feel each of their words lodge beneath my ribs, but I breathed through the ache. I dared not speak the truth of my heart, not then. The truth that I had taken Mark in because no one else had wanted him, because he had come to me shivering and hungry, and I could not turn away. The truth that I loved him because he had loved me, without condition, without the barbs of expectation and shame that sometimes guide the love of biological children. That truth would not save me if spoken aloud. It would only make Ricardo angrier, drive him further down the road toward the terrible thing I feared he was willing to do. So I kept my mouth closed, and when Ricardo's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper and he looked at me as if I were something that should be extinguished, I set my hands on my knees and listened to the sounds of the house, faint, ordinary, stubborn. The plant at my feet had drunk the juice and would stand green for a while. It would not comfort me, but it gave the room a small, earthly proof that the world keeps turning, even under the heaviest clouds. The cellar smelled of rust and mildew, a dampness that clung to the air and made every breath taste of iron. I had lived in that house for half my life, and yet my steps on the narrow staircase felt foreign, like trespassing into a stranger's dwelling. I carried only a candle stub, its flame trembling, as if it too feared what waited below. At the bottom, I froze. The flicker of the candle caught a figure in the shadows. A young woman, thin as a reed, her wrists rubbed raw from the chains that held her against the stone wall. Her eyes, wide and hollow, blinked at the light as though she were seeing daylight for the first time in weeks. She whispered hoarsely, "Please, help me." Her voice was barely a breath, yet it cut through me sharper than any blade. I knelt beside her, my hands trembling as I touched the iron shackles that bit into her skin. "What is your name, child?" I asked. "Julia," she rasped. "Julia Carter. They took me. I thought no one would ever find me here." Her body was frail, her hair matted, her lips cracked with thirst. I felt shame roll through me, not because I had put her here, but because this house, my house, had become a place of torment under Ricardo's hand. I pressed her fingers lightly and promised, "You are not forgotten. I will not leave you here." As I looked around the cellar, the candle revealed more than just Julia. Against the far wall, half buried beneath dust and cobwebs, was an old wooden chest I had not seen in years. I pulled it forward, coughing as the dust rose, and forced the lock open with a rusted crowbar that leaned nearby. The hinges groaned like an animal dying. Inside lay a stack of brittle papers, yellowed with time, yet still carrying the weight of truth. My eyes caught the first document, and I recognized it instantly: the deed to the land, in my name. It was proof, undeniable and binding, that I was still the rightful owner of this house and the soil beneath it. Ricardo had strutted about the town for years, claiming it all as his, waving papers he had forged, telling anyone who listened that his mother had given up her rights long ago. But here, in my trembling hands, was the truth. Beneath the deed were more documents: bank statements, old ledgers, receipts. And then, tucked carefully in an envelope, I found a worn leather passbook from the county savings bank. I opened it slowly, and with each line my heart tightened. Deposits, month after month, all from me. The sums were not small. They were the very money I had scraped together by selling land, sewing garments late into the night, cooking for neighbors. They were the funds that had carried Ricardo through his darkest days, when his business collapsed and creditors circled like vultures. I remembered those nights clearly, how he had sat with his head in his hands, muttering that his life was over. I had given him what I had, more than I could afford, because that is what a mother does. I had saved him from ruin, and now, years later, he walked around boasting to anyone who would listen: I built myself from nothing, with only my 2 hands. No one ever gave me a dime. His pride was built on lies, and the proof of it all lay in that little book in my hands. The bitterness burned hotter than the candle flame. He had erased me not only from his heart but from his own story, painted himself as a self-made man while I carried the scars of sacrifice in silence. And worse still, he had twisted that silence into accusation, telling the world that I had been nothing but a burden, a parasite feeding on his success. The reality was the opposite. Without me, there would have been no Ricardo to boast, no house for him to sit in, no breath for him to curse me with. I pressed the passbook against my chest and closed my eyes for a moment. The cellar was quiet, except for Julia's shallow breaths. She watched me with fear and confusion, not understanding the weight of what I had discovered, but sensing that the papers meant something powerful. "What will you do?" she whispered. I looked at her and felt a strength I had not known in years. "What I should have done long ago," I said. "I will bring the truth into the light. No more silence, no more lies." The candle flickered again, throwing shadows against the damp walls, and for the first time in years I did not feel like a prisoner in my own home. I felt like a witness, a survivor with proof in her hands and a promise to keep. Ricardo thought he had buried me in shame, but in his arrogance, he had forgotten that the past keeps records. And tonight, in this dark cellar, I had found them. Julia's thin hand reached out, clutching mine as if to anchor herself to life. I held her tightly. Together we sat in that darkness, the flame trembling between us, and I swore to myself that no matter what it cost, I would drag Ricardo's lies into the light of day. The world would know what he had done and who he truly was. And when that day came, the weight of his false pride would crush him harder than any chain. They came up the steps quiet as the footfalls of bad weather, and the sound of their shoes on the cellar wood felt like the last safe thing in the house, giving way. I had the deed and the bank book pressed against my chest like a small shield, and for a moment I allowed myself to imagine sunlight on the porch again, and to imagine carrying those papers to the clerk and slamming them down where everyone could see. Then the shadow fell across the stairwell, and I knew my time for dreaming had ended. Ricardo stood in the doorway first, that hard expression carved deeper into his face by the candlelight. He did not pretend surprised to see me. There was no pretense in him now, only an ugly sort of certainty, as if he had finally reached the edge of what even he could tolerate. Karen followed, her mouth curled like she was trying to taste victory. The two of them looked at me like a jury that had already pronounced its verdict. "You think you are clever, do you?" Ricardo said, slow and soft, the kind of slow that means violence is imminent. "Go on then, crawl down there and die with that filthy woman. Your death will be a mercy. It will be the last stain I have to deal with, and I will wash this name clean." His eyes flicked to the thin shape of Julia, chained to the wall and trembling, and he smiled as if at a spectacle. "And when you are gone, perhaps the town will finally stop seeing me through you." Karen spat the words that followed as if they were something to be swept off the table. "An old woman and a ragged girl, truly fitting to lie in the ground together," she said, the contempt in her voice, a colder thing than the cellar air. She stepped forward and grabbed the papers out of my hand, as if to prove with their theft that I owned nothing worth keeping. Her fingers were quick and cruel. Ricardo watched, and I detected the part of him that had been a boy once loosened briefly with triumph. There is a strange weight when someone decides to kill you with words first. You can feel the body buckling under the expectation. I tried to stand taller because I had nothing left to hide, but his hand closed on my elbow like a vice. He grunted, and with a movement I will never forget, he shoved me toward the dark. "Get down," he hissed. "Get down and stay there until the world forgets you." His hands were rough as rope. Karen pushed me next, and the cellar door came down like the lid on a coffin. Before the wood hit the frame, I heard Ricardo's voice like a shout from another time. "Stupid woman, you chose him, not me. Then go on and die waiting for him. See if your precious Mark comes for you now." He slammed the door hard enough that the field of dark swallowed my candle flame in a single breath. The world folded inward with a cold sound, like something closing under the sea. The lock turned. I felt the click in my bones. For a second, there was only the thud of blood in my ears and the small sound of Julia's shallow breathing. The temperature dropped by degrees, as if the house had learned how to refuse warmth to what it no longer wanted. The chains on Julia's wrists scraped like wind against metal. Her face turned toward me with a look of utter bewilderment, and I moved to her as naturally as I had once held a newborn. "Shh," I said, because the cellar had a way of magnifying fear into noise and noise into panic. "Listen to me. Listen." My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, small and steady like a careful thing. I felt for the crowbar I had used to prise open the chest earlier. It was still where I had left it propped against the wall, though now it seemed a toy compared to the weight of what had been done. I set it at my feet and took stock of Julia. The rope abrasions on her wrists, the dried salt where tears had left tracks. I found a scrap of cloth and wet it at the little bucket by the wall. And with hands that had sewn shirts and stitched hems for decades, I bound her wounds as carefully as I could. She looked at me with an expression I cannot name, part relief, part suspicion. "Will they come?" she whispered, the question as fragile as tissue paper. It is a terrible thing to hear the word will when you have been abandoned like something already spent, but I had laid that will down in Dr. Henry's hands, and I believed in the small, stubborn faith that had guided me all my life. "I told Dr. Henry to call the police if I disappeared," I said. "And I told him to contact Mark Jensen. Mark will not let them bury us in silence." Julia's lips moved like a prayer. "Who is Mark?" she asked, as if wanting the name to be more than a promise and less than a ghost. I told her simply, "He is my godson. He grew up here with us. He is a good man." I did not explain how I had fed him when he had no one, how he had slept in our spare room and learned to fold his hands at the table, how he had become the kind of man who would listen when a frightened old woman said strange things. That story would have to wait. Right then, we had to make a plan to be seen and heard. I lit a second candle and set it near the cellar window, the fragile light winking out into the thick night. If someone peered into the yard, they might see a single flicker of life against the darkness and think there was nothing to notice. But life is stubborn, and light is a loud thing if you put enough of it in the right place. I called on memory as much as cunning. The brittle steps where noises carried, the crumbling mortar where walls breathed. I took the crowbar and hammered it, not at the wall where it might be ignored, but against the large iron pipe that ran through the cellar, the one they used for the boiler. The clang rang out like a bell in the hollow night, and I measured the rhythm with my breath until my arms ached. We listened. At first there was only the steady tick of some old machine, a sound I had taken for granted. Then, faint like an insect calling back across a field, came another footfall above. Not the casual shuffle of Ricardo moving about, but a purposeful set of shoes, a different weight. I held my breath until my lungs begged for air, and then exhaled the shape of a prayer I had made about 100 times in the dark. "Mark," I whispered to the cold bricks, "come." While the noise of possible rescue told its own story, The other noise came too, muffled voices above, the sorts of violent conspiracies that flourish in the dark. I could hear them through the wood, Karen's clipped, businesslike tone mapping out preparations. "We will make it look like an escape," she said. "We will say she ran off with a man. We will burn whatever is left, and no one will ask any questions." Ricardo's laugh floated down, brittle and empty as dropped glass. "We will be free," he said. "No more shame, no more reminding." They told one another the lies because they needed one another's conviction to believe them. Down here, in the small warm pocket of the cellar, Julia's hand found mine again, and I held on not because I had hope for a miracle, but because there is a duty and comfort I will never lay down. "They will not get away with this," I told her. Perhaps I said it more as command than prayer. "We will not let them turn our lives into an alibi for their cruelty. Mark will come. Dr. Henry will not let them bury us." The lock rasped once more on the other side of the door, and then the house settled into a waiting, like a patient animal. I wrapped my arms around Julia and pressed the papers, my proof, into the crook of my arm where no bump of wood could reach it. If I could not move, if I could not step into the morning to declare what was true, then I would be the memory that carried the truth until someone came to fetch it. I had been pushed into a hole for being honest with a town that preferred rumor. It would not be the end of my story. The cellar was black as pitch, but despair had no place in me that night. Julia whimpered in the dark, her thin body pressed against the stone wall, but I forced my breath steady. I had lived too many years to let fear choke me now. I groped for the iron bar I had found earlier, lifted it with both hands, and struck hard against the water pipe that ran along the wall. The clang split the silence like a bell tolling in the night. Once, twice, again and again, I hammered a rhythm that no one could mistake for accident. "Keep breathing, child," I whispered to Julia. "Someone will hear." She lifted her eyes, dull with hopelessness, but I gave her what I could. Not strength, not freedom, but certainty. I left word with Dr. Henry. If I went missing, he would call the police. And Mark will come. The name gave her a sliver of hope, a light she clutched as if it were bread. Above us, the house was alive with its own darkness. Ricardo and Karen sat in the parlor, the glow of their lamp dancing on the ceiling. They thought themselves clever. Karen spread forged papers across the table, her voice sharp with satisfaction. "We will say she ran away with a lover," she whispered. "Some stranger from the next town. The whole place will think she was filthy. By tomorrow the shame will be hers, not ours." Ricardo leaned back, his laugh cruel and hollow. "Perfect. When the town believes she left in disgrace, no one will look for her again. And I," he jabbed his thumb at his chest, "will finally stand free. No more comparisons to Mark Jensen. Everyone calls him the Golden Son. They do not know he is nothing but a stray, a bastard. And I am her blood. I am the one who should have mattered." Their laughter was cut short by the sudden thunder of boots outside, the command of voices sharp as whips. Ricardo's head jerked toward the door. Karen sprang to her feet, but it was too late. The front door splintered open, and a storm of officers poured inside. At their head was Mark, broad-shouldered, his uniform dark against the lamp glow. His eyes swept the room like a blade. Ricardo's face twisted at the sight of him. "You!" he roared, veins straining in his neck. "You dare bring police here, in my house? You bastard! You think because she loved you more, you have won?" He lunged across the room, fists clenched, his rage no longer contained. "You stole her love from me. You, with your false smile. You are not her son. I am." Mark did not flinch. He caught Ricardo's wrist as it swung at him, his other hand gripping the man's shoulder. Ricardo struggled, spitting like a rabid dog. "You took everything from me, everything. If she had never taken you in, none of this shame would be mine. It is your fault she looks at me with disgust. It is your fault she never saw me as enough." Mark's voice was calm, quiet enough that only Ricardo could hear. "You never understood, Ricardo. She never needed anyone perfect. She only needed to be loved. That is all. That is what you refused her." Ricardo's rage broke into emptiness as officers dragged him away, Karen's screams fading behind. the cellar door burst open, flooding us with light. "Mama?" Mark's voice trembled as he rushed down, freeing Julia's wrists and grasping my hand. Weak, but unbroken, I rose. That house had been a prison, the cellar a grave, yet truth had shattered the chains. Darkness cannot bury what is meant for light. Ricardo's hatred had bound me, but it was Mark's loyalty, and justice itself, that set me free. In that moment I knew, I had not survived for silence, I had survived to rise. The courthouse in Texas was packed that morning, every bench filled, every corner buzzing with whispers. Neighbors who once avoided me now crowded forward, eager for scandal, while reporters jotted notes, their lenses sharp. The prosecutor rose, his voice like iron. "This case is not only about attempted murder, it is about betrayal and cruelty inside the walls of family. We present evidence that Ricardo Collins and his wife Karen tried to poison Martha Collins, kidnapped Julia Carter, and forged deeds to steal her home." He held up the poisoned glass, its orange stain visible to all. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Julia was called first. "Frail but determined," she said. "If not for Mrs. Martha, I would have died in that cellar. She gave me water, she gave me hope." Gasps swept the crowd. Then Dr. Henry Alvarez testified. "She warned me. She asked me to notify the police if she vanished. Without her foresight, Julia would not be alive today." Mark took the stand, his uniform crisp, his voice steady. "I was not born in her blood, but Martha Collins raised me as her own. She saved Ricardo when his business collapsed. Here is the proof." He held up a bank book filled with her deposits. He boasted he built his life alone, but without her, there would be no Ricardo at all. The room erupted until the judge's gavel restored order. Ricardo leapt to his feet, his face twisted. "Lies. She was never a mother to me. She cursed me with her failures, and now she chooses him, a stray dog, over her own son." The room froze, the tension thick enough to choke. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Reporters stopped their pens, jurors held their breath, and even the guards leaned closer. It was as if the entire courthouse waited for the answer, the final truth that could no longer be buried. The silence that followed was heavy. I rose, trembling but strong. Blood is no excuse for evil. "Ricardo, you killed the love of a mother when you chose bitterness over gratitude, when you chained an innocent girl and tried to bury me alive. Do not speak to me of betrayal. You betrayed yourself." Ricardo's mouth worked, but no words came. Karen lowered her head. The jury left and returned swiftly. "Guilty on all counts," the foreman declared. The judge's gavel struck. Life imprisonment without parole. As they were led away in chains, Ricardo still searched my eyes. I turned from him, not in hatred, but with the finality of closing a door. Justice had spoken. For the first time in years, I breathed without fear. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was freedom. After the trial, I knew I could not slip back into silence. My home, once the stage of betrayal, became the seed of something greater. I signed away every acre and cent, not to those who had cursed me, but to a foundation that would guard forgotten women, the broken, the cast aside. The house Ricardo had turned into a dungeon was remade. Chains ripped out, walls repainted, cots laid, food stored. What once imprisoned became sanctuary. They called it Home of Hope, and though my name was tied to it, I knew it belonged to every woman who stepped through its doors. News spread quickly. Reporters swarmed, their headlines bold. The burden who turned pain into justice. I told them only the truth. Too many women had been silenced, but no cruelty could erase dignity if you chose to stand. Neighbors whispered too. Those who once called me useless now spoke of how I pulled evil out by its roots. It was not apology, but it was acknowledgement, and that was enough. The day we hung the sign, the sun struck gold against the porch. Mark stood beside me, hammer in hand, his strength steady as always. Together we lifted the plank, its letters carved deep, Home of Hope. Each strike of his hammer rang like a promise. Julia watched, tears glistening, stronger now than when I had found her in that cellar. She whispered, "I thought I had lost everything, but you gave me back faith." I held her hand, warm and firm. We cannot choose where we are born, I told her, but we can choose how we rise. Her fingers tightened around mine, and in her eyes I saw strength blooming, ready to carry others as I had carried her. As we stood beneath that sign, the weight of Ricardo's curse fell away. Shame shattered into dust, replaced by light and the echo of hammers. The town would speak of it for years, but I knew what it truly was, not charity, not survival, but a beginning. I was not a burden. I was a witness who refused to die in darkness. And now, every woman who came here would see the light burning, guiding them out. Years passed, and the house that had once been filled with fear became filled with light. Home of Hope grew into a refuge where dozens of women found food, shelter, and safety. Julia walked among them as proof that broken chains could become strength. She was no longer the girl I had found trembling in the cellar, but a woman who guided others toward healing. Mark stood by her side, steady and dependable. To the women he was a protector, a reminder that compassion existed, and to Julia he became an anchor. Their bond grew slowly, woven from small gestures, his carrying heavy baskets, her tending his injured hand, the way they leaned close in the evenings as they worked. Their closeness was patient, and I blessed it quietly, simply by stepping back. One afternoon, beneath the great oak, Mark knelt with a ring in hand. His voice trembled as he said, "Julia, you turned this place from sorrow into joy. Will you let me spend my life making sure you never feel alone again?" Julia's tears were her first answer, her words the second. "Yes, Mark, yes." The women cheered, and laughter filled the house for days. Their wedding was simple, held in the garden where roses climbed the fence and wildflowers pushed through the soil once stained with grief. Julia wore white, plain but radiant. Mark stood tall in his black suit. They clasped hands beneath an arch of roses as if no one else existed. I sat in the front row, tears of joy streaming down my face. When I rose to speak, I said, "I once lost a son to hatred. I thought my family had been stolen from me forever. But today, I see a new family formed, not by blood, but by love and courage. That is the Lord's greatest gift to me." Julia ran into my arms, her gown brushing against my hands, her smile radiant. When the vows were done, Mark and Julia each took one of my hands. Together we walked to the front gate, beneath the wooden sign that read, "Home of Hope." As they stepped through, Julia glowing and Mark steady, I whispered to the breeze, "I lost a son, but the Lord gave me another, and he gave me a daughter too, the ones I truly deserve." The last image of that day stays with me. Mark and Julia smiling back at me, their faces bright with happiness no shadow could dim. Behind them the house stood tall, no longer a prison, but a sanctuary. I lifted my head high, not as a woman broken by betrayal, but as a witness to rebirth. In their joy, I found my redemption. And that is where my story finds its ending, not in silence, not in shame, but in the light of truth and the strength to rise again. What was once a prison became a sanctuary, and what was once betrayal became justice. My scars may remain, but they tell the world that even the deepest wounds can be turned into wisdom and hope. If you've stayed with me through this journey, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Stories like mine are not just mine alone, they echo the lives of countless women who endured and survived. So if you believe these voices should never be forgotten, please subscribe to Grandma True Stories and ring the bell so you'll never miss the next story of courage, justice, and redemption.